Somewhere right now you are lying still. Maybe it is late where you are. Maybe the room around you has gone quiet in that particular way rooms do when the rest of the world has finally stopped asking things of you. Wherever you are, whatever city, whatever hour, let me ask you to hold that stillness for a moment. Because what I'm about to tell you begins not with a theory, not with a mystery, but with a specific object sitting in a specific glass case in Oxford, England. The object is smaller than you would expect. It stands 20 centimetres tall, 9 centimetres wide. It is the colour of pale sand that has been baked hard in the sun, which is exactly what it is, a four-sided prism of fired clay, pressed into form by a pair of human hands roughly 4,000 years ago. It sits upright in its case on a small mount. If you walked past it without reading the label, you might mistake it for a decorative tile, a fragment of something larger, a forgotten piece of architectural ornament. But if you lean in close enough, and the museum's lighting is carefully positioned to help you do this, you begin to see the surface. Every face of this prism, all four sides, is covered in columns of tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay when it was still soft. Row after row after row of them, each column dense with information, the marks so small and precise that a magnifying glass improves the experience considerably. 8 columns in total, 4 sides. One hole bored through the centre of the prism, top to bottom, where scholars believe a wooden spindle was once inserted so the object could be rotated and read in sequence. Someone made this to be read. Someone made this to be kept. The Ashmolean Museum in Oxford holds it under accession number AN 1923.444. It was presented to the museum in 1923 by Herbert Weld-Blundell, a British antiquarian who had acquired it during a 1922 expedition to the site of ancient Larsa in southern Iraq. Before that, it had been underground for somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years. It was baked clay. It survived. Scholars call it the Weld-Blundell Prism. It is the most complete surviving version of a text known as the Sumerian King List. And the Sumerian King List begins with a sentence that, for all the academic debate it has generated over the past century, remains one of the most quietly extraordinary sentences ever pressed into clay. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. That is the first line. Not after the first king was born, not after the people chose their ruler, not even after the gods created kings. The sentence does not say any of these things. It says the kingship descended, as though it were a thing that existed somewhere above, a concept, an office, an institution, and then it came down. This is not incidental language. Across at least 16 known versions of the King List, fragments and tablets and cylinders found at sites stretching from Nippur in central Iraq to Susa in modern Iran, from Tel Leilan in northern Syria to multiple locations in southern Mesopotamia, this framework appears again and again. The kingship descends. The kingship is given. The kingship is taken to the next city. And when a dynasty ends, the kingship departs. The Sumerians did not describe their rulers as men who seized power. They described power as something that arrived from outside the human world entirely, and then when conditions required it, departed again. This video is about what that means. Not in the way the answer is usually delivered, not with confident declarations about ancient astronauts, not with dismissive assurances that it was just political mythology, not with the kind of explanation that flattens 4,000 years of a civilization's self-understanding into a single, comfortable sentence. What the evidence actually suggests is something more layered, more genuinely uncertain, and in many ways more interesting than either extreme. The Sumerian King List does not read like a simple record of the past. It reads like a document with structure, with intention, with mathematics that are too precise to be accidental, and theological language too consistent across too many independent sources to be coincidental. And when you place it alongside the other texts that emerged from the same civilization, the flood narratives, the creation epics, the hymns to divine authority, a pattern begins to emerge. A pattern that the Sumerians themselves appear to have recognised. They called it the plan of the Anunnaki. Before we can understand what was written into this prism, before we can read what the clay is actually saying, we need to understand the world it came from. A world that rose from a flat and silent plain between two rivers, built itself into something extraordinary, then passed its knowledge forward in fired clay that outlasted everything else it ever made. Drop into that world with me now. Let the room around you be still. The investigation begins in the dust. Before cities existed, stand at the mouth of what would become the Persian Gulf, roughly 7,000 years ago, and look north. What you see is not a desert, not yet. The climate in this period, the Ubaid period as archaeologists call it, roughly 6500 to 3800 BC, had not yet completed its long drying cycle, and the southern plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates was something stranger and more alive than either the marshland it would become or the arid flatness it is today. The rivers braided and shifted. Seasonal floods deposited rich silt across the plain. Reed beds spread for miles at the water's edge. The air in the lower reaches was heavy with moisture and with the smell of the rivers, which carried everything south from the mountains of Anatolia and the Zagros Range. Dark soil, organic matter, the dissolved memory of 1,000 miles of stone. This was the land the Sumerians would call Ki-on-Ki-Ra, the civilized land, the land of the black-headed people. There is a quiet paradox about this particular landscape that scholars have noted for decades. It is, by most measures, among the least naturally suited places on Earth to give rise to the world's first cities. It has no stone, no timber of any significance, no metal ores. The rivers are navigable but unpredictable, prone to catastrophic flooding without warning. The soil is fertile but demands constant management through irrigation, or it turns saline and collapses. The climate oscillates between extremes. Even the clay that would become the Sumerians' great technological medium, the material they would press into tablets, shape into bricks, mould into vessels, and ultimately used to create the world's first writing system, even that clay required sophisticated processing before it could hold a mark with any permanence. And yet here, on this apparently inhospitable plain, human beings built the first cities the world had ever seen. Eridu stands at the southern end of the plain, or what was then closer to the waterline than it is today. The site is now called Tel Abu Shahrain, the Mound of Abu Shahrain in Arabic, and it sits in the Dekar Governorate of southern Iraq, not far from the modern city of Basra. From above, it looks like a low flat hill rising from a landscape of dust and dry grass, giving nothing away. It does not look like the beginning of the world. But in 1946, an Iraqi archaeologist named Fuad Safar, working alongside the British archaeologist Seton Lloyd, began excavating the mound in earnest. The Iraq Directorate of Antiquities had sponsored the dig, and Safar would continue the work in campaigns running through 1949. What they found beneath the surface changed how archaeologists understood the deep history of Mesopotamia. They found not one occupation layer, but 18. 18 distinct building levels, one beneath the other, stacked like the pages of a very slow book written over centuries. The lowest level, level Xviyi, contained something remarkable. The remains of a small mud brick structure, a single room, with a central offering table and traces of ash that suggested fire had been used in ritual. It was, by the dating available to the excavators, roughly 6,000 years old at the time of excavation, the oldest mud brick temple ever found in Mesopotamia. What Safar and Lloyd discovered at Eridu was a continuity. Each successive building level showed the same structure rebuilt on the same footprint, each version slightly larger than the last, each one oriented the same way, each one containing the same basic elements of a sacred space. 18 versions of the same building, spanning thousands of years. The Sumerians, it appeared, had not simply built a temple at Eridu. They had maintained it. They had returned to it, rebuilt it when it collapsed or decayed, preserved its orientation and its purpose across a span of time that makes most recorded history look brief. This is the city that the Sumerian King List names as the first city, the city where, after kingship descended from heaven, it first resided. The finds from the Safar Lloyd excavations are distributed between the Iraq Museum in Baghdad and published in Safar's own 1981 volume, Eridu, the Definitive Excavation Report. What the material evidence shows is an Ubaid period settlement of genuine antiquity, with temple continuity suggesting an unbroken sacred tradition reaching back to what the Sumerians themselves would have considered the very beginning of organised human life on the plain. By the time the Uruk period arrived, roughly 4000 to 3100 BC, the southern plain had been transformed. The city of Uruk, which appears in the King List as the second city to receive kingship after Kish in the post-flood sequence, had grown into a settlement that may have housed as many as 80,000 people by the late 4th millennium BC. It was, by any measure, the largest urban centre that had ever existed on Earth. It had monumental public architecture. It had specialised craft production. It had long-distance trade networks reaching into Anatolia and the Iranian plateau. It had administrators who needed to track goods, allocate labour, manage debt, record transactions, and so it had, sometime around 3200 BC writing. The development of cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped marks that would eventually cover the Weld-Blundell Prism, began as an accounting technology. The earliest tablets from Uruk are not poetry or history or theology, they are lists. Lists of animals, lists of grain, lists of labour allocations, small clay tokens that had been used for millennia to represent quantities were gradually replaced by clay tablets on which those same quantities could be impressed directly using a reed stylus cut at an angle to produce the characteristic wedge shape. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The world's first writing system developed, at least in part, in order to make lists. The Sumerians needed a way to record things in sequence, to keep track of what was owed and what had been given, what existed and in what quantity. The earliest writing is, functionally, a record of transactions. And then, several centuries later, someone used that same technology, that system of wedges pressed into clay, to write a list of a very different kind. Not a list of sheep or grain or labour days, a list of kings, a list that began before the flood and claimed to stretch back to the moment when kingship itself first arrived on Earth from a source above. The Sumerians did not find this transition remarkable. For them, writing and governance and divine order were all aspects of the same underlying system, a system they called the me, a Sumerian word referring to the fundamental principles or divine powers that made civilized life possible. The me included things like kingship, priesthood, descent into the underworld, music, the scribal arts, truth, the sword, the weaving loom, craft mastery, and dozens of other concepts. The Sumerians understood all of these as gifts, not inventions but transmissions, things that had been given to humanity from a source beyond humanity. The King List is in one sense the administrative record of that transmission. It documents not only who ruled, but how ruling itself entered the world. To understand why that matters, and to understand why the document that records it is as strange and as carefully constructed as it is, we need to follow the modern story of its discovery. Because the King List was not always known, it had to be found. And the story of how it came to light tells us something important about what we almost lost, the discovery of a strange document. By the 1880s, the major cities of ancient Mesopotamia had been known to European scholarship for several decades. The great mounds of Assyria, Nineveh, Nimrud, Khorsabad had yielded their treasures in spectacular fashion during the mid-19th century, filling the British Museum and the Louvre with colossal stone reliefs and thousands of cuneiform tablets. The Epic of Gilgamesh had been identified in 1872 by George Smith, a self-taught cuneiformist working in the British Museum's tablet room, who recognized a flood story in a fragmentary tablet from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and caused an international sensation. The world had begun to understand that beneath the soil of modern Iraq lay an entire civilization whose written records were still, to a remarkable degree, intact. But the focus in those early decades had been largely on Assyria, the northern civilization of the first millennium BC, militaristic and monumental, whose texts were written in Akkadian. Sumer, the older southern civilization that preceded the Assyrians by nearly 2,000 years, was less understood. Its language, a language isolate, related to no other known tongue, with a grammatical structure entirely unlike the Semitic languages of Akkadian and Hebrew and Aramaic, was only beginning to be deciphered. In 1888, the University of Pennsylvania launched the first American archaeological expedition to Mesopotamia, targeting the ancient city of Nippur. The site had been tentatively identified a few years earlier, and the university's newly founded Department of Archaeology saw an opportunity to establish itself as a serious scientific institution. The expedition was led by the Reverend John P. Peters, with the young German-American Assyriologist Hermann Hilprecht serving as epigraphist. Their task was to excavate. They were not entirely prepared for what they would find. Nippur was extraordinary. In the course of 4 expeditions running from 1889 through 1900, the team and its successors uncovered thousands upon thousands of cuneiform tablets from a site that turned out to have been one of the great intellectual and religious centres of the ancient world. Not a capital city, Nippur never served as a seat of political power, but a sacred city, a centre of learning and scribal training that preserved texts across centuries and across the rise and fall of empires. When one power succeeded another in Mesopotamia, the scribal schools of Nippur continued. The Temple of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, anchored the city's religious identity, and the texts produced by Nippur's scribes reflected the full range of Sumerian literary and religious thought. Among the roughly 60,000 tablets and fragments that were eventually recovered from Nippur, most of them from the Old Babylonian period, roughly 1900 to 1600 BC, were multiple copies of the Sumerian King List. Not complete copies, for the most part, fragments, partial columns, sections of dynasties that could be matched against other fragments to reconstruct the larger text. Hermann Hilprecht published the first fragment in 1906, recognizing its significance but lacking enough material to understand the document's full scope. The picture became clearer in 1911 when the French Assyriologist Jean-Vincent Scheele published a more complete version he had found at a different site entirely, Susa, in what is now western Iran. This tablet, known as the Scheele dynastic tablet, covered the king list from the Uruk dynasty through the Uathori period. It was the first indication that the text had circulated beyond the boundaries of Babylonia proper, that it was known and copied in regions far from its original home. Then in 1922, Herbert Weld-Blundell, an English gentleman antiquarian, conducted a brief excavation at the site of ancient Larsa, a major Sumerian and Babylonian city in southern Iraq, active from roughly the late 3rd millennium through the Old Babylonian period. From this dig came the clay prism that now sits in Oxford. It arrived at the Ashmolean Museum in 1923 and was immediately recognised as something exceptional, the most complete, most carefully preserved version of the King List yet known. The scholar who undertook the first serious scholarly analysis of the document was Thorkild Jacobsen, the Danish-American Assyriologist who had come to the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, one of the great centres of Mesopotamian scholarship, in the 1930s. In 1939, Jacobsen published the definitive study, The Sumerian King List, Assyriological Studies No. 11, Oriental Institute, University of Chicago. This work gathered every known version of the text, compared them systematically, established a working composite, and provided both transliteration and translation. Jacobsen's 1939 analysis also set the tone for scholarly interpretation that would hold for decades. In his reading, the King List was fundamentally a political document, a piece of ideological literature created by the scribal establishment of the Akkadian period, later expanded and revised by the Uruk III and then Old Babylonian dynasties, each iteration designed to position the current ruling power as the legitimate inheritor of a divinely sanctioned kingship that stretched back to the beginning of time. The impossibly long reigns of the Antediluvian kings, Alulim of Eridu ruling for 28,800 years, Enmenluana of Bad Tibera for 43,200 years, the 8 pre-flood kings collectively accounting for 241,200 years of continuous royal governance, were, in Jacobson's reading, either scribal conventions or deliberately exaggerated figures in keeping with ancient Near Eastern literary traditions of attributing great antiquity to revered ancestors. It was a sensible interpretation. It fit the evidence as it was understood in 1939, and it contained important truth, but it did not quite answer everything the document contained. The problem was not the long reigns themselves. Those could be accounted for by scribal convention or mathematical artifice. The problem was the framework, the specific, consistent, theologically precise framework in which the entire document was embedded, a framework that did not vary across versions, that was present in the Nippur fragments and the Susa tablet and the Weld-Blundell Prism alike, that appeared even in the oldest known version, the Uruk III Sumerian King List, its colophon placing its copying in the reign of Shulgi around 2084 BCE, a version that predates the political circumstances Jacobson identified as the document's purpose. The framework says, kingship comes from above. It is given. It departs. It is given again. To understand why this framework matters and what it was describing, we need to read it more carefully than it is usually read when kingship descended from heaven. The Sumerian term that opens the King List is Namlugal, 2 words pressed together into a single concept. Nam is an abstract prefix, a way of nominalizing a state of being, of making a condition into a thing. Lugal is the Sumerian word for king, literally big man, a compound of lu and gal or rate. Together, Namlugal means something like kingship, not a king, but the condition of being king, the office itself, the authority that makes a particular human being a ruler rather than simply a man. The sentence in Sumerian reads, Namlugalan ta ed3 thra. After kingship had descended from heaven. The verb ed3 thra is the root for descending, for coming down from above. The preposition anta means from an, or from heaven, the sky, the realm above. The possessive structure makes kingship the subject of this descent, not a king. Kingship, as an abstract entity, came down. Thorkild Jacobson, in his Treasures of Darkness, the great 1976 study of Mesopotamian religion that represents the culmination of his life's work, described the Sumerian understanding of kingship as a cosmic concept. The king, he wrote, was not merely an administrator, he was the human, representative of a divine order, chosen and empowered by forces that transcended the human world entirely. The word Namlugal, in Jacobson's reading, carried the implication of a divinely instituted office, something that existed in the divine realm before it was instantiated in any particular human being. This is a crucial distinction. The King List does not say the gods created the first king. It says kingship, the office, the authority, the capacity for legitimate rule descended. The passive voice of dissent suggests that whatever source this authority came from did not simply hand it to a person. It transferred an institution, a framework, a system. Where did it descend from? The text says, from heaven. The Sumerian word for heaven, An, is also the name of the chief deity in the earliest Sumerian pantheon, the sky god An, later partially supplanted by Enlil as the dominant divine authority. The equation between sky and divinity is not coincidental. For the Sumerians, the visible sky, the vault of stars, the movements of planets, the ordered procession of celestial bodies was the most visible manifestation of a divine intelligence that governed the world from above. The sky was the source of order, and the Namlugal came from it. The mainstream scholarly interpretation of this language, developed by Jacobson and refined by later scholars, including Peter Steinkeller of Harvard University, holds that the descent from heaven formula is primarily ideological. In Steinkeller's analysis, presented in his 2003 research on the political purpose of the skill, the document was likely first composed during the Akkadian period to position the dynasty of Sargon of Akkad as the legitimate heir to the Mesopotamian tradition of kingship that stretched back to Kish. The theological language of heavenly descent was a rhetorical device. By framing kingship as something given by the gods rather than seized by men, any ruling dynasty could claim divine legitimacy simply by appearing in the list. The Antediluvian section may have been added even later by old Babylonian scribes working in the Icene period, precisely to extend the list far enough back in time to make the entire sequence appear inevitable and cosmically ordained. This interpretation has significant scholarly support. It is well argued, textually grounded, and consistent with what is known about the political uses of religious literature in ancient Mesopotamia. It is probably, in large part, correct, and yet it runs directly into a problem that the evidence creates and does not resolve. The problem is this: if the descent from heaven framework was a later addition, a rhetorical device added by old Babylonian scribes to legitimize political power, why does it appear in the oldest known version of the text? The Ur-3 Sumerian King List, with its colophon placing it in the reign of Shulgi 2084-2037, predates the Old Babylonian period by 2 centuries. The Ur-3 period was not a time in which the Essene dynasty needed legitimizing. Essene did not yet exist. And yet the Ur-3 version of the King List, despite being structurally different from later versions in many respects, preserves the same essential theological framework. Kingship comes from above. It is given to cities. When a city falls, kingship departs. The framework is not a later addition. It is present at the beginning of the tradition. Steinkeller himself has argued that the precursor to the skell may have originated during the Sargonic period in a form that resembled the uskul. But even this earlier origin does not account for the theological framework's remarkable persistence and consistency. Every scribe who copied the document across centuries and political changes and geographic distances preserved this single framing device unchanged. Kingship comes from heaven. It does not originate in human will or human achievement, which raises the question the text seems designed to raise. What if this was not a rhetorical device? What if the Sumerians were trying to record something they believed was literally true? The language of the Nam-Lugal, carefully parsed, describes an institution that precedes the cities it inhabits. Kingship exists before Eridu. It arrives at Eridu. When Eridu's time is over, it moves to the next city. This is not the language of metaphor in the way that later scholars have sometimes presented it. The Sumerians had metaphorical language. They were sophisticated literary craftsmen who could distinguish between a divine figure acting symbolically and a divine figure acting directly. When they wanted to speak metaphorically, they generally indicated that they were doing so. The King List does not indicate metaphor. It uses the same direct, administrative voice as the rest of its content, the same voice that lists the names of kings and the lengths of their reigns with the matter-of-fact precision of an official register. One reading, the reading that this document will pursue without forcing a conclusion, is that the Sumerians were preserving a genuine belief about the origin of governance, that human beings had not independently invented the institution of kingship, but had received it, that it had been transmitted to them by a source they called the Anunnaki, the council of highest divine beings, and that the King List was, in some sense, the record of that transmission. Whether one reads this as theological mythology, as encoded cosmological teaching, or as something more literally meant, is a question the document does not definitively answer. But to understand what it might be encoding, we first need to look at the numbers. because the numbers in the king list are not random and they are not human. 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years. The Antediluvian section of the Weld-Blundell Prism occupies the first 39 lines of the text. 8 kings, 5 cities, a total accumulated reign of 241,200 years before the flood swept over and erased the world. The kings are listed as follows: Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years; Alalgar of Eridu, 36,000 years; Enmen-Luana of Bad Tabira, 43,200 years; Enmen-Garlana of Bad Tabira, 28,800 years; Dumazid of Bad Tabira, 36,000 years; Ensipad-Zidana of Lorog, 28,800 years; Enmen-Juana of Zimbir, 21,000 years; Ubaratutu of Shuruppak, 8,600 years. Those reign lengths, at first encounter, appear to be the obviously mythological element of the text, the part that signals to a modern reader that this is not history, that these figures were not real, that the document is not meant to be taken literally. And for most of the 20th century, that was broadly how scholars treated them. But in the mid-20th century, several researchers began to notice something that changed the interpretive picture. The reign lengths were not random. They were not simply large and impressive sounding numbers. They were all, without exception, multiples of specific mathematical units. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system, sexagesimal as mathematicians call it, rather than the base 10 decimal system we use today. This is the same system that gave us the 60 seconds in a minute, the 60 minutes in an hour, the 360 degrees in a circle, Sumerian mathematics, preserved in our timekeeping and geometry without most people knowing where it came from. Within this sexagesimal system, the Sumerians used 3 principal large units: the Sos 60, the Ner 600, and the Sar 3600, 60 times 60. Every antediluvian reign in the king list is an exact multiple of the Sar. Alulim's 28,800 years is exactly 8 Sars. Alolgar's 36,000 years is exactly 10 Sars. Enmen-Luana's 43,200 years is 12 Sars. And 43,200 is itself a number with peculiar resonance in the history of ancient mathematics, appearing in sources as geographically and chronologically disparate as Berossus's Babyloniaca, the Hellenistic period Babylonian history that preserves traditions, dating to the much older Mesopotamian sources and certain astronomical calculations from the same region. Enmen-Garlana's 28,800 years repeats Alulim's 8 Sars exactly. Dumazid's 36,000 years repeats Alolgar's 10 Sars exactly. The total, 241,200 years, is itself 67 Sars, 67 times 3,600. Thorkild Jacobsen observed this mathematical patterning in 1939 and concluded that the numbers were consciously invented, that is, artificially constructed using the sexagesimal system to produce impressive sounding but formally structured reign lengths that conveyed venerability rather than historical fact. This remains the dominant scholarly interpretation. The reigns are literary mathematical constructions, not records of actual durations. Michael Roten, writing in the mid-20th century, extended this observation by noting that the reign lengths in the Gutian dynasty later in the king list, all 5, 6, or 7 years, were similarly structured around sexagesimal conventions. About 6 years in the Sumerian sexagesimal framework was the equivalent of a general round number, like about 10 years in a decimal system. What these analyses establish is that the numbers in the king list were not generated by observation, they were generated by calculation. Someone, or some tradition, constructed these reign lengths using a mathematical framework. The question Jacobsen's interpretation does not fully address is, calculated to encode what? Consider the specific numbers more carefully. The antediluvian reigns range from 18,600 to 43,200 years. They are not uniform, they vary, which means there is information encoded in their variation. Alulim's 28,800 and Ensipad-Zidana's 28,800 are identical. Alalgar's 36,000 and Dumuzid's 36,000 are identical. This repetition is deliberate. If the scribe had simply wanted to indicate great antiquity with round numbers, they would not have needed to repeat specific values across different kings in different cities. And then there is the total, 241,200, 67 SARs. In the sexagesimal system, 67 is not a round number, it is 60 plus 7. The 7 is notable. The number 7 carries enormous significance in Mesopotamian cosmology, 7 heavens, 7 divine decrees, the 7-branched tree of life, the 7 sages called the Apkallu, who brought civilization to humanity before the flood. 7 appears repeatedly as a number of completion, of cosmic wholeness, in Sumerian and Akkadian texts. The total duration of antediluvian kingship, 241,200 years, or 67 SARs, embeds the number 7 into the sexagesimal framework in a way that was almost certainly intentional. Some researchers have gone further, noting that 43,200, the longest individual reign, belonging to Enmenluana of Bard Tibera, has a particular relationship to the precessional cycle of the Earth's axis, which completes one full revolution in approximately 25,920 years. The ratio of 43,200 to 25,920 is 5:3, a ratio that appears in Sumerian mathematics in contexts suggesting astronomical awareness. This particular observation is in contested territory. It is suggestive rather than demonstrated, and the evidence for direct Sumerian awareness of precession in this period is debated among scholars. What is not debated is that Sumerian astronomical observation was sophisticated, and that the mathematical traditions of the region were capable of encoding complex numerical relationships into literary texts. What the numbers establish, at minimum, is this: the antediluvian section of the King List is not a naive record of remembered history. It is a mathematically constructed document. Someone built these numbers deliberately using the sexagesimal system to produce a specific total and specific internal relationships. The question of what those relationships were meant to encode, cosmological cycles, divine ratios, astronomical periods, or simply literary convention, is one that current scholarship has not definitively resolved. But the mathematical precision of the construction does suggest something beyond political propaganda. Political propaganda does not typically require this level of mathematical attention. It requires large and impressive numbers, not specifically structured ones. The mathematical architecture of the antediluvian section points toward a tradition that was preserving something, encoding something in the numbers themselves. What that something was begins to come into focus when we look at the names of the kings themselves. The names written before the flood. The 8 antediluvian kings are not simply a list of rulers. They are a list of identities, and the names on that list, when examined closely, contain information that the reign lengths alone do not provide. Alulim, the first king, whose name can be translated from Sumerian as either horn of the red deer or seed of the red deer, depending on which version of the cuneiform signs one follows, a small orthographic ambiguity that scholars have noted since Jacobson's 1939 analysis ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. He is the first name written on the Prism. He is the first human to hold the office of Namlugal after its descent from heaven. Alaulgar, the second king of Eridu, ruled for 36,000 years. His name is more difficult to parse etymologically. Jacobson suggested a possible connection to the Sumerian alar, a type of drum or musical instrument, though this reading remains uncertain. What is clear is that Alaulgar represents the completion of Eridu's portion of antediluvian kingship. After his reign, the city fell, the same word used throughout the text, more precisely meaning something like was defeated or its turn ended, and kingship was taken to Bad Tibera. Bad Tibera receives 3 kings, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, and Dumuzid. And here the list does something that is, by any measure, unusual for an administrative document. Dumuzid, the fifth antediluvian king, assigned 36,000 years of rule, is a god, not a deified king, not a legendary figure elevated to divine status through centuries of veneration, a deity already well established in the Sumerian divine pantheon before this text was composed, with his own independent mythology, his own temples, his own elaborate theological tradition. Dumuzid, later known to the Akkadians as Tammuz, and to the ancient Near Eastern world more broadly as the archetypal dying and rising god, the shepherd deity whose descent into the underworld and annual return marked the agricultural cycles of planting and harvest, appears in the King List as a political administrator, as a king who ruled a city for 36,000 years and then yielded office when his term was complete. Thorkild Jacobsen, who studied Dumuzid's mythology in depth in Treasures of Darkness, recognised this as a genuinely anomalous feature of the text. The presence of Dumuzid in the Antediluvian King List, he wrote, suggests that the boundary between the divine and the royal was not, for the Sumerians, a fixed line. The Antediluvian period was characterised in the Sumerian theological framework as a time of direct divine-human interface, a period when the beings who governed the world were not clearly distinguishable as either fully divine or fully human. The Eridu Genesis tablet, CBS 1673, held at the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, excavated from Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania campaigns of 1889-1900, preserves fragments of a related tradition. This tablet, written in Sumerian and dated to the Old Babylonian period, deals with the creation of humanity, the establishment of the antediluvian cities, and the appointment of their rulers. The preserved passages describe the Anunnaki as the agents of these appointments. It is the great gods who decide which cities will exist, which kings will govern them, and when the flood will come to end the antediluvian era. The text is fragmentary, roughly 2/3 of it are missing, but what survives aligns closely with the King List's framework while providing additional detail about the divine deliberation that preceded the descent of kingship. Enmen-Du'ana, the seventh antediluvian king, who ruled in Zimbir-Simpshar for 21,000 years, appears in several other Sumerian and Akkadian texts as a figure of extraordinary sacred significance. He is associated with divination, specifically with the art of reading omens in oil and water, and later Mesopotamian tradition credited him as the ancestor of the divination priest class. A text known as the Tablet of the Diviner describes him as a mortal who was elevated to the presence of the great gods Shamash and Adad, and taught the secrets of divination, which he then transmitted to his descendants. He is thus not merely a king in the administrative sense of the King List, but a specific type of figure, one who received esoteric knowledge directly from the divine realm and encoded it for transmission to future generations. This same pattern, a king who is also a recipient of divine knowledge, whose reign is tied to a specific type of cultural or intellectual legacy, appears to structure the entire antediluvian list in ways that are not immediately visible from the names and reign lengths alone. The 5 cities of the antediluvian era, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larag, Zimbir, Shuruppak, each had specific divine associations and specific areas of cultural importance. Eridu was the city of Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water. Bad Tibira was associated with metalworking. Its name means something like the fortress of the copper worker, which connects it to the transmission of craft knowledge. Zimbir was the city of Shamash, the sun god and deity of justice and divination. Shuruppak was later famous as the home of Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian flood hero known in the Sumerian flood tradition as Yesudra, the last city of the antediluvian era, the place where the pre-flood world ended. Each city in the antediluvian list, in other words, appears to represent a different domain of civilized knowledge and practice. The sequence of cities is not simply a sequence of political capitals. It is, at least from one reading, a sequence of knowledge centres, places where different aspects of the me, the divine cultural gifts, were maintained and practiced. Whether this was deliberate on the part of the document's composers, or whether it reflects genuine memory of an earlier geographical and intellectual organisation of southern Mesopotamia, is precisely the kind of question that the King List raises without answering. The 8th king, Ubaratutu of Shuruppak, ruled for 18,600 years, the shortest antediluvian reign, which may be significant, as though the tradition knew that Shurupak's era was truncated by what was coming. Ubaratutu is identified in the flood traditions as the father of Ziusudra, the man who survived the flood and preserved the seed of humanity and the animals. His presence at the end of the Antediluvian list creates a direct narrative connection between the list and the flood narrative. Then come 5 of the most important words in the entire document. Then the flood swept over. Amaru Baru 3. The flood swept over. Those 4 syllables appear in the Sumerian text of the King List as a kind of geological marker, a line across which everything on one side belongs to one category of time and everything on the other belongs to another. Before the flood, 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years of divinely structured governance. After the flood, a new beginning, kingship descending again, this time to the city of Kish, and then moving through the great cities of Mesopotamia across hundreds of dynasties, spanning centuries of gradually more historical, gradually more archaeologically verifiable time. The flood is the hinge of the entire document, and the flood is where the King List intersects with the wider tradition of Mesopotamian literature in the most revealing way. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on CBS Wenso 673 at the Penn Museum, the tablet excavated from Nippur and dated to the Old Babylonian period, describes the flood from a specific perspective. In this version, it is the god Enlil who decides that humanity must be destroyed. The noise of human civilization, the text implies, has become intolerable to the divine realm, a cosmic disruption requiring correction. The other gods, and here the Anunnaki, are invoked as a collective, deliberating council, agree. But one god, Enki, the god of wisdom whose primary temple was at Eridu, does not agree, or at least does not act in full accordance with the decision. He warns a single man, Ziusudra, allowing him to build a vessel and preserve himself, his family, the animals, and the seed of life. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablet BM 78941, among others, in the British Museum collection, this version dated to approximately 1635 BC and found at Sippar, provides the most detailed version of the same narrative. Here the full deliberation of the divine council is presented. The Anunnaki and the Igigi, the lower class of gods, are described as having created humans specifically to relieve themselves of the labour of maintaining the earth and the irrigation canals. Humans were made to work, but then humans multiplied, and their noise, the Akkadian word used, is rigmu, which can mean both sound and tumult, disturbed the sleep of Enlil. The god tried several measures short of total destruction, plague, drought, famine. Each time the human population recovered. Finally, the flood was decided upon as the definitive solution. What makes the Atrahasis account relevant to the King List is the structure of the divine decision making it describes. The Anunnaki in the Atrahasis telling are not simply a pantheon, they are a governing council. They deliberate, they vote, they have factions. Enki dissents, or at least evades, while Enlil enforces. The flood is not an impulsive divine act, but a policy decision reached through a process that the text describes in terms that would not be out of place in an account of a human governmental assembly. This is the council that, in the Sumerian understanding, also decided to send kingship down from heaven in the first place. The same body that constructed the antediluvian system of governance was the body that decided to end it with the flood. And when the waters receded and the world began again, it was the same body that descended kingship once more, this time to Kish, with a new set of kings and a new sequence of cities. What the parallel between the King List and the flood narrative suggests is that the flood was not, in the Sumerian theological framework, simply a catastrophe. It was a deliberate interruption of a deliberate system. The Antediluvian era, those 8 kings, those 5 cities, that mathematically encoded span of 241,200 years, was not ended by accident. It was ended by decision. And after the decision was executed and the earth was reset, the system was restarted, which implies that the system, the institution of kingship descending from heaven, the sequential governance of cities, the specific assignment of cultural domains to specific locations, was designed to be restartable. That whoever or whatever constructed the antediluvian order knew it would be interrupted, and built into the King List both the record of the original system and the framework for its continuation. The flood, in this reading, was not an ending, but a reset. And the King List was the reset code. Who are the Anunnaki? Before we go further into the structure of the King List and what it implies, we need to spend time with the beings the Sumerian texts identify as its architects. The Anunnaki are one of the most discussed and most distorted subjects in the popular literature about ancient Mesopotamia, and the distortions are so thick that recovering an accurate picture of who they actually were in the original texts requires some care. The name Anunnaki, transliterated from the Sumerian as Anunnakafor, appears in the tablets with a range of spellings and a meaning that scholars have debated for over a century. The most careful etymological analysis, provided by the German philologist Adam Falkenstein and later refined by Bertha Kienast, concludes that the most plausible translation is those of princely seed or of royal blood, a phrase that identifies the Anunnaki not by what they do, but by what. They are beings of elevated origin, of a stock above the ordinary. Falkenstein's interpretation has been broadly accepted by Assyriologists, including Michael Heiser, who summarised the scholarly consensus as placing the Anunnaki firmly in the category of highest divine beings, the council of major gods, rather than any category derived from a specific physical location like the sky or the earth. Zechariah Sitchin's popular translation of Anunnaki as those who from heaven came to earth, the foundation of his widely read but academically rejected series of books, is, as the Assyriologist Michael Heiser and others have documented at length, based on a misreading of the Sumerian signs. That does not align with how those signs are used elsewhere in the corpus. The academic consensus is clear on this point. The Anunnaki were not, in the original texts, defined as beings who descended from another planet, but the scholarly consensus about what the Anunnaki were not does not fully capture what the texts say they were. In the Atrahasis epic, the Anunnaki are the great gods, the senior divine figures of the Mesopotamian pantheon, the ones who hold the tablets of destiny, who make the fundamental decisions about the cosmos. They are explicitly distinguished from the Igigi, the lesser gods who were assigned the labour of digging canals and maintaining the earth before humans were created. The Anunnaki rest. They deliberate. They hold assemblies. They decide. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that survives on 7 tablets, found primarily at Nineveh in the library of Ashurbanipal, with additional fragments from the 1924-1925 Oxford-Chicago excavation at Kish, the Anunnaki appear as the council that ratifies Marduk's supremacy after his victory over Tiamat. They affirm his kingship. They assign divine functions. They establish cosmic order. The text describes them pronouncing Marduk's 50 names, a list of divine titles that collectively describe his authority over all domains of existence. The scene is, structurally, the same type of scene as the beginning of the King List, a divine council deciding on the nature and direction of governance. In the hymns and lamentations of the Sumerian literary tradition, the Anunnaki appear as judges, the 7 great judges who sit before Ereshkigal in the underworld, who pronounce destiny for the dead. They appear in royal hymns as the guarantors of legitimate kingship, the beings who set the foundation of the throne for the human king. The phrase Anunna, in the various contexts where it appears across the cuneiform corpus, consistently denotes beings of authority, of legitimating power, of cosmic governance. None of the original texts say the Anunnaki came from another planet. None of them say the Anunnaki were physical beings who landed on Earth and performed genetic experiments. These claims belong to the popular literature of the late 20th century, not to the tablets. But what the texts do say, consistently and across many independent sources spanning centuries, is this: the Anunnaki made decisions about humanity. They created humans. They decided how humans would be governed. They gave kingship its structure and its purpose. They withdrew it when they judged it necessary, and they transmitted knowledge to specific human intermediaries, figures like Enmen-Jorana, the seventh Antediluvian king, who were elevated to the divine council and given information to carry back to the human world. The question that the King List raises, quietly through its structure rather than through any explicit claim, is not whether the Anunnaki were aliens. It is something more fundamental. If the Sumerians believed that the governing order of human civilization was designed by a divine council, and if the King List was their attempt to record the history of that design and its execution, then what does it mean that the document opens with the institutional structure of governance rather than with the names of rulers? The King List could have begun, Allulim was king in Eridu. That would have been sufficient for a political document. Instead it begins, after the kingship descended from heaven. The institution is named before the person who holds it. The design is declared before the designer's work is displayed. This is a theological statement about priority. The institution of kingship, the framework of governance, the structure of power preceded the individuals who exercised it. It was not created by them, it was given to them, and according to the Sumerian texts, it was given by the Anunnaki. The first king after the waters receded. When the flood ended, when the waters receded and the earth dried, and the survivors came out of their vessels and made offerings to the gods, and the gods, as the Atrahasis epic describes, gathered like flies over the sacrifice, the world needed to begin again. The Sumerian King List records this restart with the same economy of language it uses throughout. After the flood had swept over and the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. And the first king of Kish, the first human ruler of the post-flood world, according to the list's framework, was a man named Etana. Etana's entry in the King List is brief. It says he was a shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign countries, and that he ruled for either 635 or 1,560 years, depending on which version of the text one consults. The variation in his reign length across copies suggests some uncertainty in the transmission. But his characterization as one who ascended to heaven, an action described in the same language as the descent of kingship from heaven, but in the reverse direction, is consistent across all versions. Outside the King List, Etana has his own independent literary tradition, the Legend of Etana, a narrative text known from multiple cuneiform copies spanning the Old Babylonian through Neo-Assyrian periods. The most substantial British Museum exemplar is tablet K 2606, which contains a significant portion of the Old Babylonian version. The narrative also exists in the standard Babylonian Etana epic, published in the State Archives of Assyria Cuneiform Texts Series, Volume 2, from Helsinki. The Legend of Etana is, at its heart, a story about the continuity of the royal line and about what must happen to maintain it. Etana is king of Kish. He has built temples. He has performed the proper rites. But he has no son. Without a son, the royal line will end, the continuity of kingship will be broken, and the divine institution of governance will be disrupted. The problem is not merely dynastic, it is cosmic. If kingship has been given by the Anunnaki to human civilization as a governing framework, then the failure of the royal line is not simply a private tragedy, but a systemic failure, a breakdown in the divine plan. What Etana needs is the plant of birth, a specific botanical substance associated with the ability to conceive children, which exists not in the human world, but in the divine realm, in the heaven from which kingship itself descended. To obtain it, Etana must go there. He cannot do this alone. Enter the eagle. The tablet K2606 describes how the gods laid the foundations of Kish and established Etana as its king. It describes a sacred tree, a poplar growing at the edge of the city, and the relationships of an eagle and a snake who both nest in this tree, one in the branches, one at its base. The eagle and the snake swear an oath of friendship before the sun god Shamash. The eagle breaks this oath by eating the snake's children. The snake appeals to Shamash, who directs it to a specific location, a trap, where the eagle is caught and disabled. Etana, guided by Shamash, finds the eagle in the pit and restores it. In return, the eagle carries Etana upward on its wings toward the heaven where the plant of birth is held. The ascent is described in sensory detail that is unusual for Mesopotamian administrative literature, the land below growing smaller, the sea becoming a ribbon, the mountains shrinking to the size of pigs. The upper heaven is described as a specific place, a divine precincts beyond the clouds. Whether Etana successfully obtains the plant of birth depends on which version of the text one reads. The narrative is fragmentary and the ending is unclear, but the structure of the story is itself significant independent of its conclusion. The first post-flood king in the Sumerian telling cannot maintain the divine institution of kingship without making a physical transaction with the heavenly realm. He must go up to the source of kingship to receive what is needed to continue it. This is the same transaction that the opening of the King List describes in the opposite direction. The kingship comes down, Etana goes up. The institution of governance exists at the intersection of these two movements, a continuous exchange between the human and the divine, a relationship that must be actively maintained, not simply inherited. What the Etana story adds to the framework established by the King List's opening line is the mechanics of that maintenance. Kingship does not simply descend once and remain. It requires renewal. It requires the human king to reach back toward its source. The office is not a possession, but a relationship. And this relationship, in the Sumerian understanding, was maintained not merely by individual kings, but by the civilization itself, through its temples, its rites, its scribal traditions, its careful preservation of texts like the King List, that recorded the terms and the history of the arrangement. Etana's legend, placed at the opening of the post-flood sequence, functions as a kind of instruction manual. This is what the first king did to maintain the divine order. This is the effort required. This is the direction one must face, upward toward the source from which the institution descended. The structure of the King List following Etana is the record of how that effort continued and how occasionally it failed. The architecture of the list. The Sumerian King List is a document with a grammar, not grammar in the linguistic sense alone, though the text is linguistically precise. Grammar in the architectural sense, a set of structural rules that govern how each unit of the document relates to every other unit, and how the whole implies a larger pattern that no single section can contain by itself. Every dynasty in the King List follows the same template. A city receives kingship. One or more kings rule with specific reign lengths. The dynasty ends. The text announces, then Kish was defeated, and the kingship was taken to Uruk, or Ur, or Lagash, or wherever the next holder of the Nam, Lugal, will be. The passive voice in that announcement, the kingship was taken, is consistent across all versions, and across both the pre-flood and post-flood sections. Kingship is never seized. It is never conquered. Military defeat determines which city's turn has ended, but the transfer of the Nam, Lugal itself, is described as a passive event, as though an external agent moves it from one location to the next. The text does not say who moves it. It does not name the agent of the transfer. But the framework established in the opening line makes the implied source clear. The same force that sent kingship down from heaven in the beginning continues to direct its movements through the human world. Peter Steinkeller, in his research on the political purposes of the Sumerian King List, makes a compelling case that this structural grammar served specific ideological functions. By presenting kingship as a single, indivisible institution that passed from city to city, never shared, never divided, always moving from one legitimate seat to the next, the document argued implicitly that there was always one legitimate ruler of all Mesopotamia, and that the current holder of kingship was the inheritor of an unbroken tradition stretching back to before the flood. For the Akkadian kings, who may have been the document's first audience, this framework positioned them as the continuers of a divine order, not merely as military conquerors. For the Isin dynasty, in whose year the Weld-Blundell Prism was copied, it argued that Isin's current hegemony was not a new departure, but the latest expression of a pattern established at the beginning of time. Steinkeller's interpretation is almost certainly correct as far as it goes. Political purposes explain a great deal about the document's creation and its various revisions. But there is an aspect of the document's structure that political purpose does not fully explain, and it is this: the grammar is too consistent to be merely propagandistic. Propaganda adapts to its audience. It emphasizes what is useful and downplays what is not. The King List, by contrast, does not omit dynasties that were embarrassing or confusing from a legitimating perspective. It includes the Gutian interregnum, a period when a foreign people from the Zagros Mountains held power over Mesopotamia with the same structural formula as every other dynasty. It includes the notice that after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, who was king, who was not king, an admission of political chaos that no propagandist would have wanted to preserve. It includes dynasties from cities like Mari in northern Syria that were not central to the South Mesopotamian political tradition the document was supposedly designed to serve. The tell only what serves the narrative approach, which is what propaganda does, would have produced a leaner, more selective document. The King List preserves things that do not serve the propagandistic purpose. It preserves them because the document's structure demanded completeness. The grammar of the Namlugal had to be followed even when what it said was inconvenient, because the grammar was the point. This is what the Tel Leilan fragment makes particularly interesting. Found at Tel Leilan in the Upper Kabul region of northeastern Syria, this copy of the Sumerian King List is one of only two known versions found outside of Babylonia proper, the other being the Shield dynastic tablet from Susa. Tel Leilan was a major city in the 3rd millennium BC, associated with the ancient city of Shekna. Its distance from Nippur and Larsa, the main centres of cuneiform culture in southern Mesopotamia, means that someone carried this tradition, this specific grammar of kingship, across hundreds of miles, not for political propaganda purposes that would have been relevant to the people of Shekna, for reasons of their own. Perhaps because the framework it contained, the idea of a single divinely sanctioned kingship passing through history in sequence, was understood as a cosmic truth rather than merely a political claim. The architecture of the list, then, suggests something that its political uses cannot entirely account for, a belief that the structure of governance in the human world was a direct reflection of a divine ordering principle, that the movement of political power from city to city was not random or simply military, but followed a pattern determined by the same intelligence that had established the institution in the first place. The grammar of the King List is the grammar of a plan, and the Sumerians, when they copied it from generation to generation across their most widely distributed sacred city, appear to have understood it as such. Gilgamesh, when myth becomes the list. There is a moment in the Sumerian King List when the document performs what might be described as a controlled experiment on the boundary between myth and history. It does this not through any authorial commentary, the text never explains itself, but simply by placing a particular name in a particular column. In the Uruk dynasty, after the post-flood kingship had passed from Kish through several transfers, the list records a sequence of rulers in the great city of Uruk. Among them, listed as the 5th king of the Uruk dynasty, is Gilgamesh. The entry assigns him 126 years. His predecessor, Dumuzid the fisherman, is assigned 100 years. His successor, Ur-Nungol, 30 years. The reign lengths are declining. The long spans of the early post-flood dynasties have been compressing steadily, moving from thousands toward hundreds, toward numbers that are approaching the human. Gilgamesh rules for 126 years. Outside the king list, Gilgamesh is the subject of what is arguably the most celebrated literary work to survive from the ancient world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, assembled from older Sumerian poems and consolidated into the canonical Akkadian version during the 2nd millennium BC, describes him as a king of Uruk who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, son of the goddess Ninsun and a human father. He builds the walls of Uruk. He forms a friendship with the wild man Enkidu. He travels to the cedar forest and destroys its divine guardian Humbaba. He refuses the advances of the goddess Inanna. He searches for immortality after Enkidu dies and learns from Utnapishtim, the flood survivor of the Babylonian tradition, that immortality is not for humans. The Sumerian individual poems about Gilgamesh, preserved on tablets from the Nippur collection at the Penn Museum and the Yale Babylonian collection, present him as a complex, partly divine, partly mortal figure whose story is also, in the deeper sense, a story about the limits of the human condition. He is a king who reaches toward the divine and is turned back. He is 2/3 God and 1/3 man. He rules for 126 years, not 28,000, not 36,000, but 126. His place in the king list marks a transition. Looking at the Antediluvian section, 8 kings, reigns of 18,600 to 43,200 years. Looking at the first dynasties after the flood, kings of Kish with reigns from 1,500 years down to 6 years, the numbers declining irregularly. The Uruk dynasty shows a particularly sharp compression. Enmakar 420 years, Lugalbanda 1200 years, Dumuzid 100 years, Gilgamesh 126 years. After Gilgamesh, his son Ur-Nungol rules for 30 years, then another king for 15. The numbers have become human. What the king list structure suggests, and this is a reading of the document's architecture rather than an explicit claim made in the text, is that the document charts a gradual withdrawal. The extraordinary long reigns of the antediluvian period, whatever they represent, compress across the early post-flood dynasties. The semi-divine figures of the early Uruk period, Enmerkar and Lugalbanda, are also independent literary heroes. Figures whose divine connections are explicit in the poems about them give way to rulers with increasingly human reign lengths. Gilgamesh, described in his own epic as 2/3 divine, rules for 126 years and is succeeded by rulers who are unambiguously mortal. The divinity in the king list structural narrative is being diluted. The post-flood order begins with echoes of the antediluvian direct divine-human interface, and then, gradually, the purely human takes over. The kings after Gilgamesh's generation are historical. Enmebaragesi of Kish, who appears in the king list as the 12th ruler in the Kish dynasty, is the first king confirmed by contemporary archaeological inscription. A stone bowl bearing his name, dated to roughly 2600, was found in the field. His son, Aga of Kish, appears in the poem Gilgamesh and Aga, itself preserved on Nippur tablets, as a contemporary of Gilgamesh's and an entirely human political rival. The convergence of the legendary and the historical around the time of Gilgamesh and Enmebaragesi is not coincidental. The king list architecture places this convergence exactly where one would expect it if the document were indeed charting the progressive regularization of a divine order, the moment when a system that had operated under conditions of direct divine involvement transitioned into a world where humans were increasingly expected to manage the institution of kingship on their own. The Epic of Gilgamesh, read alongside the King List, reinforces this structural reading. Gilgamesh's story is the story of a man at the boundary, two-thirds divine, searching for what was lost at the flood at Utnapishtim, specifically describes the antediluvian world as one where immortality was accessible to humans, attempting to reach back toward the divine source and finding, in the end, that the boundary cannot be crossed. The walls of Uruk, the city walls he builds as his lasting achievement, are explicitly framed in the epic's prologue as the record he leaves behind. Not divinity, not immortality, a human achievement, a monument built of brick. This is exactly the transition the King List charts. Before, divine measures of time, divine human kings, direct transactions with the heavenly source. After, human time, human kings, human monuments. The Nam-Lugal still descends, the pattern still holds, but the directness of the divine-human interface diminishes. What Gilgamesh's position in the list suggests is that the Sumerians understood their own civilization as standing at a specific point in this transition, not at the beginning when the Anunnaki's plan was being implemented in its fullest form, but after a rupture, after the flood, attempting to maintain and honour a framework that had once been held in place by forces that no longer interacted with the human world in the same way. The King List is, from this angle, a document of inheritance, a record passed forward by people who knew they were not the originators, who understood themselves as stewards of something older than themselves. Three readings of the same stone. The Weld-Blundell Prism, standing in its glass case at the Ashmolean Museum, is patient. It has been read by graduate students in the early hours of the morning, by museum visitors who do not speak Sumerian, by Assyriologists with magnifying glasses, by tourists with phone cameras, by scholars whose interpretations of it contradict each other entirely. It holds its 8 columns of wedge-shaped marks with complete indifference to what people decide they mean. What the preceding investigation has established through multiple lines of evidence is this: the Sumerian King List is a document with mathematical precision, theological consistency, structural grammar, and historical awareness. It is not naive, it is not accidental. It was constructed deliberately, copied faithfully across centuries and geographies, and treated by the civilization that produced it as a document of foundational importance. Its framework, kingship descending from a divine source, governing in sequence through the cities of the world, periodically reset and reissued, is not incidental to its content. It is its content. 3 interpretations of this framework exist. They are not mutually exclusive, they have different implications, and the evidence supports elements of each. The first interpretation is political mythology. In this reading, the King List was created by scribal establishments working in the service of successive political powers, Akkadian, then Ur-3, then Isin, and its theological framework was a deliberate rhetorical construction. The divine origin of kingship was asserted because it was useful. It made every current ruler the inheritor of a cosmic mandate rather than merely the victor of the most recent military campaign. The Antediluvian section was added to provide even deeper antiquity to the sequence. The Anunnaki, in this reading, are the ideological agents of political legitimization, not real governing entities, but divine names attached to a political argument. This interpretation is well supported by Steinkeller's research, by the document's evident revisions across political eras, and by analogies in other ancient Near Eastern political literature. The second interpretation is encoded cosmological teaching. In this reading, the King List was the vehicle for a sophisticated understanding of cosmic time, governance cycles, and the relationship between human and divine orders. The mathematical precision of the antediluvian reigns, their structure around the sexagesimal system, their total of 67 stars, their possible astronomical correspondences, points toward a tradition that was using the format of a king list to encode and transmit knowledge about the structure of cosmic time and the place of human civilization within it. The flood becomes, in this reading, not a historical event, but a cosmological symbol, the periodic correction of a world that has fallen out of alignment with divine order. The restoration of kingship after the flood becomes the symbolic recommitment to a pattern of governance designed to maintain alignment. This interpretation is consistent with what is known about Sumerian astronomical sophistication and with the broader pattern of Mesopotamian religious literature using narrative forms to encode cosmological teaching. The third interpretation is historical documentation, a preserved memory of actual events and actual governance structures that predated the flood. In this reading, the antediluvian kings were, from the Sumerian perspective, genuinely historical figures. The mathematical encoding of their reigns was not fiction, but a form of preservation, using the sexagesimal framework to maintain numbers that had been transmitted across the catastrophic interruption of the flood, ensuring that the count of pre-flood time was not lost. The 5 antediluvian cities were real centres of pre-flood civilization. The Anunnaki were real governing entities, their nature remaining ambiguous in the original texts, their specific identity left open, who designed and implemented a structure of human governance that the flood interrupted and afterward reinstated. In this reading, the King List is the Sumerians' attempt to record the truth of their own origins, not that they invented civilization, but that they restored it. Each of these interpretations has strengths. The first explains the document's political uses and its revisions across time. The second explains its mathematical precision and its cosmological framework. The third explains why the framework was preserved with such consistency across versions that had no shared political purpose, why a copy at Tel Leilan in the Syrian steppe preserved the same theological grammar as a copy at Nippur or Lhasa. The strongest argument against the first interpretation alone is the Tel Leilan fragment. Political propaganda serves local political purposes. The presence of the King List at Tel Leilan, far from the centres of Babylonian power, in a city that had no political reason to legitimise a Babylonian notion of kingship, suggests the document carried meaning that transcended its political uses. The strongest argument against the second interpretation alone is the document's specifically administrative character. Cosmological teaching in the ancient Near East was generally embedded in mythological narrative, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The King List uses not narrative but register, names, numbers, transitions. The form of administrative record applied to cosmological content suggests that its authors understood it as genuinely documenting something, not merely encoding a symbolic structure. The strongest argument against the third interpretation alone is the impossibility, by any standard chronological measure, of the antediluvian reigns as historical durations. No human governance structure operated for 28,800 years. The reign lengths are not historical in the literal sense. But the third interpretation does not require literal historical accuracy to be meaningful as a record of the Sumerians' own understanding of their past. A people who genuinely believed that their civilization had been designed by divine beings, established before a global catastrophe, survived through deliberate divine preservation, and restored to a post-flood world, would record that belief in precisely the way the King List records it, as an administrative document describing the sequence of events and the institutions involved, using the mathematical tools available to them to encode durations that were understood as cosmic rather than human in scale. The honest assessment, after following the evidence across tablets and excavations and scholarly debates, is that the King List is most fully understood as all three things at once: a political document that was also a cosmological record, that was also, from the Sumerian perspective, a genuine history. It served different purposes for different people in different eras, but underlying all of those purposes was a framework that the Sumerians clearly understood as foundational truth. Kingship was given. It did not arise from within the human world. And the document that records its history is, in that sense, a record of a plan the Sumerians attributed to the Anunnaki, the council of beings they described as holding the tablets of destiny, who sent the institution of governance down from wherever they resided and set it moving, through the cities of the world. Whether that plan was divine will, cosmological necessity, political invention, or some preserved memory of a pre-flood order, is the question the stone keeps patient and silent. What the plan would mean. Consider what the third interpretation implies, if it has merit. It implies that the Sumerians understood themselves not as the inventors of civilization, but as its inheritors. That the cities they built, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, were not original creations, but restorations. That somewhere in the memory of the people who pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay and organised the world's first writing system was the knowledge that writing and governance and organised urban life had existed before, in a different form, in a different era, in a world that the flood erased, and that what they were doing was recovering and reinstating a pattern that had preceded them. This would explain a feature of Sumerian culture that has puzzled historians of technology for a long time, the apparent suddenness of the Uruk period's civilizational achievements. Between roughly 4000 and 3100 BC, the city of Uruk went from a mid-sized agricultural settlement to the largest urban centre in the world, with monumental public architecture, advanced administration, long-distance trade networks, and a writing system. The Uruk expansion, a period of Mesopotamian cultural influence spreading across the ancient Near East, represents a rate of institutional and technological development that historians have found difficult to fully explain through the gradual accumulation of local innovation alone. The mainstream explanation invokes the specific ecological conditions of the southern Mesopotamian plain, the demands of large-scale irrigation agriculture creating organisational pressures that drove social complexity, combined with the advantages of river-based trade and the particular genius of the Sumerian people for institutional innovation. This explanation has genuine merit. Environmental pressures do drive social complexity, but it does not fully account for the specific character of what appeared in Uruk. Not just complexity, but sophistication. Not just organisation, but a coherent conceptual framework, the me, the divine gifts of civilization, that treated the elements of urban life as a received package rather than a set of independent inventions. If the Sumerians genuinely believed they were restoring a pre-flood system, if the King List's framework of descending kingship reflected an actual tradition about the origins of governance that was maintained through the flood by specific human survivors and then reinstated, then the Uruk period's rapid sophistication becomes, at least in principle, a different kind of phenomenon, not the invention of civilization, but the reinstallation of it, the recovery of a pattern that had been preserved in collective memory, religious tradition, and specific technical knowledge across the catastrophic interruption of the flood event. The Eridu Genesis tablet CBS 1673 describes the antediluvian cities being established by divine decision. The gods give kingship to specific locations, assign specific rulers, and establish specific traditions. If there were humans present during the antediluvian period, and the King List's own framework requires this, since the kings who administered those 241,200 years were at least partially human, as their subsequent descendants demonstrate, then some portion of that antediluvian knowledge would have been preserved by the survivors. Not all of it, perhaps most of it was lost. But the framework, the idea that governance descended from above, that it was structured according to a divine plan, that specific cities had specific roles in maintaining the me, that framework could have been preserved in oral tradition and ultimately written down. This raises questions for which the evidence does not provide answers. If the antediluvian kings were genuine governors of a pre-flood civilization, what was the nature of that civilization? The 5 cities named in the King List, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larag, Zimbir, Shuruppak, are all in the southernmost part of the Mesopotamian plain. 4 of them have been at least partially excavated. Only Eridu has yielded evidence of occupation going back to the Ubaid period to the 6th millennium BC. The other sites have Ubaid period or early Uruk period layers, but nothing that corresponds to a civilization of the scale the King List implies. The geological and archaeological evidence for a significant flood event in the Mesopotamian region, likely a catastrophic flooding of the lower Euphrates delta, perhaps connected to a period of rapid sea level rise in the Persian Gulf, exists in several forms, including a flood stratum found at multiple sites in southern Iraq. But the evidence is for a regional catastrophe, not a global one. These are the limits of what the evidence can tell us, and they are real limits. The Sumerian King List cannot be verified as literal historical record for the antediluvian period. The reign lengths are mathematically encoded, not observed. The 5 cities cannot be archaeologically demonstrated to have been the centres of a 241,200-year governance structure. What the evidence can support is a tradition, a genuine, consistent, carefully preserved tradition in which the people who built the world's first cities understood themselves as standing in relationship to a structure of governance that preceded them, a tradition they encoded in mathematics, embedded in theology, distributed across geography, and kept legible in fired clay for 4,000 years after the flood they believed had interrupted it. The plan they described may have been divine, or cosmological, or political, or a memory, but it was a plan. The document says so clearly from its first line to its last. The list has no ending line. The Weld-Blundell Prism ends mid-dynasty. The last rulers recorded on its 4 clay faces belong to the dynasty of Isin, 14 kings, beginning with Ishbiera and ending with Sin-Magir. The prism was copied, its colophon indicates, during the 11th year of Sin-Magir's reign, which places the document's creation at approximately 1817-1800 BC. Sin-Magir died during this period or shortly after. His dynasty would give way to the dynasty of Larsa within a few decades. Within 2 centuries, the old Babylonian empire of Hammurabi would have absorbed both. The list then ends not at the end of history, but at the edge of the scribe's present. It records as far as the scribe knew, which was as far as the world had gone. Beyond the last line of the Essene dynasty column, the clay face of the prism is empty. There is no closing formula, no declaration that kingship has returned to heaven, no announcement that the plan has been completed. The list simply stops, and that stopping, that open, incomplete edge, is perhaps the most honest thing about it. The Sumerians did not claim to know how the plan ended. They claimed to know how it began, with a descent, with a purpose, with a specific city and a specific king, and a specific arrangement of divine authority translated into human form. They documented what they could trace. They inscribed it carefully, with precise numbers and consistent grammar, on an object designed to be rotated and read and preserved. Then they stopped at the boundary of their own knowledge and left the rest open. The clay has held the text for 4,000 years. The question it contains, not the political question of which dynasty holds power, but the deeper question of where governance itself comes from, and who designed it, and what the flood was meant to accomplish, and whether the 8 kings who ruled before the waters came were real or mythological, or something the categories of real and mythological were not designed to hold. That question has not been answered, not by Jacobson, not by Steinkeller, not by any of the careful scholars who have spent careers reading the cuneiform marks. The marks have been read. The question persists. Maybe that is appropriate. The Sumerians themselves appear to have understood the knowledge they preserved as inherently incomplete, as a partial record of something larger, a fragment of a plan whose full scope was not available to human understanding. The 7 Apkallu, the semi-divine sages of the Antediluvian tradition, were said to have brought the full complement of civilizational knowledge to humanity before the flood. After the flood, the Apkallu were replaced by human sages who were merely wise, not divine. The knowledge that returned to the post-flood world was imperfect, partial, a human reconstruction of what had once been given whole. The King List is, in that sense, a document about the limits of what can be preserved. It records the frame of a picture, much of whose content is gone. It preserves the structure, the descended institution, the sequence of cities, the numbered dynasties, the mathematical architecture of the Antediluvian era, without being able to explain fully what that structure was for or where it ultimately leads. What it does preserve is enough. It preserves the knowledge that the people who built the world's first cities did not understand themselves as starting something new. They understood themselves as continuing something old, something that had been planned, interrupted, and restored, something that came from a source they described with the greatest precision their language allowed, from heaven, through the Anunnaki, into the cities of the plain, through the specific human beings chosen to hold the office of kingship for their appointed span. The prism in the glass case holds all of this in 8 columns of marks, no larger than a child's thumbnail. It is 20 centimetres tall, 9 centimetres wide, baked clay from a river plain that no longer has rivers where they once ran, found in 1922, pressed in 1800 BCE, recording a tradition that the Sumerians themselves placed 4,000 years before that. Before you close your eyes tonight, consider what it means that this object exists, that someone made it, that someone buried it, or lost it, or left it in the ground, and that the ground held it for nearly 4,000 years without destroying it, and that it emerged into the light again in the hands of people with enough patience and enough curiosity to learn to read the language pressed into it. The Sumerian King List does not tell us what the Anunnaki were. It does not prove a plan. It does not provide a diagram of a pre-flood civilization. It does something quieter and, in many ways, more consequential than any of those things. It preserves the memory that a plan was understood to exist, that the people who built the cities believed the cities were built for a reason, that they recorded that belief in the most durable medium available to them with the most precise mathematical tools they possessed, and distributed it across their world. They were telling whoever came later, whoever learnt to read the marks, that the beginning of civilization was not accidental. Whether you find that thought disturbing or comforting or simply interesting depends on questions only you can answer. The prism is still in Oxford. The clay is still patient. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever time it is where you are, let the thought settle quietly into the dark, like sediment dropping through still water. The kingship descended from heaven. What came before it is still being read. The keepers of the measure. There is a text that most people who have heard of the Anunnaki have never read. It is not the King List. It is not the Atrahasis or the Enuma Elish. It is a Sumerian myth known to scholars as Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the me, preserved on a large 6-column tablet from the Nippur collection, catalogued as Tablet 15283, now in the collection of the Penn Museum, Philadelphia, and published in a foundational translation by Samuel Noah. Kramer, the great mid-20th century scholar of Sumerian literature at the University of Pennsylvania. Kramer's work on this text, included in his Sumerian mythology, Warkaktini, 1944, brought to English-speaking scholarship one of the most structurally revealing documents to emerge from the cuneiform archive. The myth tells a story about the me, those divine principles of civilized existence that the Sumerians understood as the underlying framework of organized human life. In the opening of the text, the me are held by Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, in his temple E Engura at Eridu, the first city. the city the King List names as the initial seat of descended kingship. They are listed in extraordinary detail across the preserved portions of the tablet. The list includes lordship, the descent to the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, the scribal arts, descent of kingship, the throne of kingship, the exalted and enduring crown, the royal regalia, the priestly offices, truth, the weaponry of battle, the art of music, the weaving loom, the reed working craft, and dozens more. Over 100 are named, covering the full range of what made Sumerian civilization recognizably itself. Inanna, the goddess of Uruk, travels to Eridu and obtains the me from Enki. The specific mechanism of the transfer is a subject of scholarly discussion, with the text presenting it as a combination of divine hospitality and Inanna's strategic cunning. She loads them into her boat of heaven and carries them from Eridu to Uruk. Enki attempts to recover them, sending his minister Isimud with a series of divine messengers to intercept Inanna's boat at various stations along the journey. Each time, Inanna refuses to give them back. The me arrive at Uruk. The myth is not, on its surface, about the King List, but its structural logic illuminates the King List's framework in a way that few other texts do. The me are not invented in the myth. They are not created by Enki. They already exist in his keeping when the text begins. He holds them as a custodian, not as their creator. When they transfer from Eridu to Uruk, from the first city of the Antediluvian era, associated with Enki and with the deepest origins of Sumerian civilization, to the great city of the historical period that will receive kingship first in the post-flood sequence, something is being described. That is structurally identical to what the King List describes when it says, then the kingship was taken to Uruk. The me moved, the institution moves. The divine framework of civilized governance is not destroyed when one city's time ends. It transfers. It relocates. It continues in a new vessel, in a new city, under a new set of human administrators, but its substance, its content, its authority remains continuous. This is the logic of the King List made mythologically explicit. The Nam-Lugal, the kingship, is one of the me explicitly listed in the myth of Inanna and Enki. It is a package among packages, an institution among institutions, a divine gift that can be held in one location and then transferred to another. Its transfer does not diminish it. It arrives in Uruk intact. And Enki, whose city Eridu is the first to hold the descended kingship, whose divine domain encompasses the very wisdom that the King List was presumably composed within, does not destroy the me when he fails to recover them. He accepts their transfer. The plan proceeds. What this parallel text reveals is that the Sumerians had multiple literary frameworks for expressing the same underlying idea, that the elements of civilization were not human achievements but divine endowments, that they moved through history in ways governed by a larger intelligence, and that the record of those movements, whether in the form of a myth about a goddess and a boat, or in the form of an administrative register of kings and dynasties, was worth preserving with the greatest care available. The King List and the myth of Inanna and Enki are not the same type of document, but they are documents about the same reality, approached from different angles. One is a record of sequence. The other is a story about mechanism. Together, they describe a complete picture. There is a divine source of civilizational authority. It is transmitted through specific agents and locations. It moves through history according to a logic that transcends individual human lifetimes. And the Sumerians understood themselves to be living within that movement, not above it or outside it. What Berossus remembered. Several centuries after the last dynasty entered on the Weld-Blundell Prism, a Babylonian priest named Berossus composed a work in Greek called the Babyloniaca, a 3-volume history of Babylon addressed to the Macedonian king Antiochus I Soter, written sometime around 281-278 BCE. Berossus had access to the cuneiform archives of the Temple of Marduk in Babylon. He was a trained scholar, and his work represented a deliberate effort to translate Babylonian historical and mythological tradition into a form comprehensible to the Hellenistic world. The Babyloniaca does not survive. We know it only through fragments quoted by later Greek and Roman authors, Josephus, Eusebius, Alexander Polyhistor, who preserved excerpts of sufficient detail to reconstruct significant portions of its argument. What Berossus preserved in his Antediluvian section is, in many respects, a variant of the Sumerian King List tradition. He listed 10 kings who ruled before the flood, each with a reign given in Sars. His total for the 10 Antediluvian reigns was 432,000 years, a different number from the King List 241-200, but one that is itself built from the same sexagesimal units. 432,000 is 120 Sars, and 120 is itself 2 times 60, a formally structured number within the base 60 system. The discrepancy between the King List's 241,200 and Berossus's 432,000 is one that scholars have debated without fully resolving. The most straightforward explanation is that Berossus was working from a different version of the tradition, possibly one incorporating the Akkadian and later Babylonian developments of the original Sumerian framework, which had been modified across the centuries between the Weld-Blundell prisms. Composition around 1800 BC and Berossus's writing around 280 BC. But what is significant is not the discrepancy in total years. What is significant is the consistency of the framework. Berossus, writing in Greek for a Hellenistic royal court, working from Babylonian archive centuries removed from the original Sumerian texts, preserved the same fundamental structure, a series of antediluvian kings with extraordinary reign lengths, a flood, and then a post-flood sequence of more historically recognizable dynasties. He preserved the tradition that these kings were associated with divine beings. He described the first king, whom he called Aloros, as appointed by divine will to rule, and he maintained the idea that the antediluvian era was characterized by direct divine human contact of a kind that ended with the flood. He also preserved the tradition of the Apkallu, the 7 sages, the semi-divine wisdom bearers who accompanied each antediluvian king and served as the transmitters of civilizational knowledge. In Berossus's version, these figures emerged from the sea as composite beings, part man, part fish, and taught humanity the arts of civilization. His most detailed description of this tradition concerns a figure he called Oannes, whom he described as appearing from the Persian Gulf in the time of the first antediluvian king to teach humans writing, geometry, the arts, the construction of cities, the founding of temples, the principles of law, and agricultural technique. From that time, Berossus wrote, according to the preserved Greek fragments, nothing further has been invented. The phrase is remarkable. Not from that time, nothing was forgotten. Not from that time, humans continued to develop what they had learned, but nothing further has been invented. The suggestion is that the complete package of civilizational knowledge was delivered at the beginning, and that what human beings have done since is not invention, but application, elaboration, and, after the flood, recovery. This is precisely the framework of the Sumerian King List. The institution of kingship was not invented by humans. The me were not discovered by human ingenuity. The Apkallu brought the complete framework of civilization before the flood. The flood interrupted the application of that framework. The post-flood era is the period of recovery, reinstallation, and maintenance, not creation. Berossus wrote this 3 centuries after Alexander the Great. The tradition he preserved was already ancient by then, traceable back through the Babylonian and Assyrian scribal schools to the original Sumerian sources. The fact that the same framework, divine transmission before the flood, catastrophic interruption, post-flood restoration, survived across 2,000 years of cultural and political change, across the transition from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Assyrian to Neo-Babylonian civilization, suggests that the people of Mesopotamia did not treat it as a political invention. They treated it as a foundational account of how the world came to be organized. Whether one accepts that account as literal history, or understands it as cosmological teaching, or reads it as mythological encoding of something more material, the persistence of the tradition across the entire recorded span of Mesopotamian civilization is itself a form of evidence. The Sumerians were not the only people who knew about the plan. They were the people who first wrote it down. The silence between the dynasties. There is a moment in the Sumerian King List that is easy to read past, because it is so brief, so tonally flat, that the weight of what it says does not immediately register. It comes in the section covering the fall of the Akkadian Empire. Sargon of Akkad had built the first true empire in recorded history, a state that at its height stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean and from the Zagros Mountains to the Taurus Range. His dynasty had ruled for several generations through the reigns of his son Ramush, his second son Manishtushu, his grandson Naram-Sin, and Naram-Sin's son Shar-Kali-Sharif. Then, sometime around 2154 BCE, the Akkadian state collapsed. The reasons are debated by historians: drought, political fragmentation, the invasions of the Gutian people from the Zagros highlands, but the collapse itself is not debated. The empire ended. The King List records the reigns of the final Akkadian kings. Then it writes a sentence unlike any other in the document. The Sumerian is brief. The translation is, then who was king, who was not king. The list, which has maintained its disciplined structure across hundreds of entries, city king years, then next city, stops. It does not name a successor, it does not record a dynasty, it asks a question. In the middle of an administrative register of supreme political authority, someone, the scribe, the tradition, the document itself, inserts two rhetorical questions into the record. Who was king? Who was not king? This is not political propaganda. Propaganda does not preserve its own failures. Propaganda does not admit that there was a period when the question of legitimate governance could not be answered. Yet the King List, which every previous dynasty presumably used to position itself as the next legitimate holder of the Nam Lugal, preserved this admission without altering it across all known versions. Even the Weld-Blundell Prism, the product of the Essene scribal school, the version composed to demonstrate Essene's own legitimacy as the current holder of kingship, retained this line. 4 kings are then named as having ruled simultaneously or in rapid succession for a total of only 3 years. The document moves on, recovering its structure, continuing through the Gutian period and the restoration under Utu-Hingal of Uruk and the Great Ur-3 dynasty. But those 2 questions persist in the record. They persist because they were true. There was, at least from the Sumerian perspective, a period when the identity of the legitimate king was genuinely uncertain, when the plan, if one accepts the framework, was in abeyance, when the Nam Lugal was not clearly anywhere, when the institution of descended kingship was, for a brief and apparently agonizing moment, in suspension. The King List preserves this not as an embarrassment, but as a data point, because the logic of the document's framework requires it. If kingship is a real institutional entity that moves through history according to a divine logic, then periods of its apparent absence are as important to record as periods of its clear presence. The question who was king is not an admission of defeat. It is an acknowledgement that the plan operates on a scale and according to a logic that human institutions do not always successfully track. The Sumerians understood governance as something given from above and occasionally, deliberately or accidentally, withdrawn. The chaos that followed Shar-Kali-Shari's death was not, in their framework, the system breaking down. It was the system resetting, a smaller scale version of the flood, an interruption between one phase of the plan and the next, visible only in retrospect as a transition rather than an ending. This is the patience that the document structure implies, that the interruptions are part of the pattern, that the periods of who was king, who was not king, are as much a feature of the plan as the long-ordered dynasties that precede and follow them. That whoever designed the framework, whoever the Anunnaki were, however one understands that word, designed it to include interruption as one of its operating conditions. The plan does not require unbroken execution, it requires eventual resumption. And in every case, across the entire span of the king list, the kingship did resume. Another city received it. Another dynasty began the count again. The questions were answered eventually by the next entry in the list. The weight of what was preserved. Step back from the tablets for a moment. Consider the sheer administrative effort that the preservation of the Sumerian King List required. From the earliest version, the Ur-3 Sumerian King List, copied in the reign of Shulgi around 2084 BC, to the Weld-Blundell Prism, copied around 1800 BC, is nearly 3 centuries. From the Weld-Blundell Prism to the fragments preserved at Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria, one must account for the physical transport of a text tradition across hundreds of kilometres of territory. From the old Babylonian versions through Berosus's Greek synthesis in 280 BC is another 15 centuries. The tradition of the Antediluvian King List, in one form or another, survived from at least 2084 BC to at least 280 BC, a span of over 1800 years of active transmission, copying, translation, and interpretation. 1800 years of a single tradition, maintained by scribal schools that outlasted every empire that employed them. The Nippur scribal school, from which the majority of surviving King List fragments came, continued to function through the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, through the Ur-3 period, through the Old Babylonian period of Hammurabi, through subsequent political changes that reorganized the governance of Mesopotamia multiple times. The scribes at Nippur copied the King List, they copied the Atrahasis, they copied the Epic of Gilgamesh, they copied the myth of Inanna and Enki, they copied the hymns to the Anunnaki and the lamentations over fallen cities, and the mathematical tables and the astronomical observations and the medical texts and the law codes. They preserved a civilization's self-understanding across the civilizations that superseded it. What this suggests, practically, is that the preservation of the King List was not an accidental byproduct of general archival activity. It was a deliberate priority. The text appears in more copies, from more sites, across more centuries than most other Sumerian literary compositions. Someone kept deciding that it needed to be recopied. Someone kept deciding that the tradition of the descended kingship, the Antediluvian kings, the flood as hinge, and the post-flood resumption of the divine plan was worth a significant investment of scribal time and clay and fuel for the kiln that its preservation required. The question of why is not fully answered by the political propaganda explanation for the reason already discussed. Many of the copies were made in contexts where the specific political utility of the document was not obvious. The Tel Leilan copy, the Susa copy, the Nippur copies made after the political circumstances that might have motivated the text's original composition had changed entirely. What the preservation history suggests, more than anything else, is that the Sumerians and their Babylonian and Assyrian successors understood the King List as a document about the nature of reality, about the way the world actually worked, not about who happened to be in power at any given moment. The descended kingship was a fact of their cosmological universe, the way the movements of the planets were a fact, observed, recorded, preserved, and transmitted, because failing to preserve and transmit it would be a failure of the civilization's duty to the knowledge it had been given. The Apkallu of the Antediluvian tradition, the 7 semi-divine sages who served as advisors to the 8 kings before the flood, were described in later Babylonian sources as having taken tablets of knowledge and buried them at Sippar. the city of the sun god Shamash, before the flood came. The tablets were buried so that, when the waters receded, they could be recovered. The knowledge was physically preserved in anticipation of the catastrophe, entrusted to the earth itself to hold through the interruption. This image, knowledge buried before a flood, waiting to be recovered, is the most concentrated version of the entire framework the King List encodes. The plan does not depend on continuous human memory. It does not require that every person who comes after the catastrophe understands what was lost. It requires only that the records survive in some form, in some medium durable enough to outlast the interruption, for the people who come after to read when they are ready. The Sumerians pressed their records into clay. The clay survived. Whether by design or by accident, whether the preservation of the cuneiform archive represents the fulfillment of the Apkallu's intention, or simply the fortuitous durability of baked earth, the effect is the same. The record was kept. The tradition of the descended kingship, the plan attributed to the Anunnaki, the framework that says governance was given rather than invented and can be lost and found again, all of it survived long enough to be excavated from the ground of modern Iraq, carried to museums in Oxford and Philadelphia and Baghdad and London, and read by people who had no other way of knowing that 4,000 years ago a scribe in the city of Lhasa pressed a reed stylus into clay and wrote, with the calm precision of someone recording a thing that was simply true, after the kingship descended. From heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The weight of what was preserved is not merely historical. It is the weight of a civilization's deepest conviction about itself, that it was not the first, that what it knew had been given before it existed, and that its highest duty was not to improve upon the gift, but to keep it legible for whoever came next. We are the whoever that came next. The clay is still legible. What we do with the reading is, as it has always been, entirely our own.